I purchased an abandoned tiny house and faced unexpected drama. Title: I purchased an abandoned tiny house and faced unexpected drama. So, I have to share this wild experience I had when I impulsively decided to buy an abandoned tiny house. I know. It sounds like a bad decision from the get-go, but hear me out. I've always had this fascination with tiny houses. There's just something so cozy and minimalist about them that draws me in. I was scrolling through Craigslist one afternoon, doing the usual wasting time, when I stumbled upon a listing. It said, "Abandoned tiny house for sale, cash only, needs some work, but price is right." The listing was bare bones, like no photos and no real info other than the price. But it was dirt cheap, honestly, way below what I expected for any kind of house. It didn't even seem like it could be real, but I figured, why not? I'd seen enough renovation shows to think I could fix it up. So, I shot the seller a message, and within hours, I was on my way to see the house. It was about an hour outside of the city in this really quiet, secluded area. When I got there, I had to drive down this long dirt road that was barely wide enough for my car. The house was tucked away behind some trees, and it looked exactly like something out of a horror movie. The tiny house was, well, tiny. It was a single room, probably around 200 square feet. It had a nice porch, a weird-looking rusted metal chimney, and honestly, it didn't look like it had been lived in for years. The windows were covered in moss, and the front door barely opened. But it was solid. Like, structurally, it didn't seem like it was falling apart or anything. It had potential. I talked to the seller, who turned out to be an older guy, probably in his 70s. He explained that he had bought the house years ago, but after some personal issues, he just walked away from it. He had no plans to fix it, so he just wanted to get rid of it. He told me that the land the house was on had a bit of a history. Apparently, there was some weird legal stuff with the property and a neighbor who didn't like the idea of the house being there, but the guy wasn't too concerned. I figured, what could go wrong? The price was ridiculously low, so I didn't think twice. We did the paperwork that day, and I transferred the money. He handed me the keys, and that was it. I was the proud and slightly nervous owner of an abandoned tiny house. Now this is where things started getting weird. The first night I stayed in the house, I noticed a few things. There was no electricity, and the water system was definitely not working, but that's to be expected with a house that hasn't been used in so long. What was odd was this feeling of being watched. I kept hearing faint footsteps around the house, like someone was walking on the porch or in the yard. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks, right? The next morning, I went to get started on fixing things up. I was in the process of replacing some of the rotting wood on the porch when I noticed an old, faded letter sticking out from under the porch steps. It was sealed with wax, but it looked ancient, like something from the early 1900s. I opened it up, and it was a handwritten note that made absolutely no sense. It was full of ramblings about cursed land and hlar something dark that dwells beneath. Naturally, I brushed it off, thinking it was some old prank or something left behind by the previous owner. But then things started happening that I couldn't ignore. The next few days were filled with strange occurrences. My tools would go missing, the door would creak open on its own, and sometimes I'd hear what sounded like whispers outside. I tried to chalk it up to the house settling or the wind. Nothing supernatural, right? But the feeling of being watched never went away. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. And that's when I noticed something odd. There was a small shack at the far end of the property, hidden behind a dense line of trees. I hadn't seen it before, so I walked over to check it out. The door was locked, but there was a small window, and I could see inside. What I saw made my heart drop. It looked like someone had been living in there recently. The inside was filthy, with trash strewn everywhere, and there were burned candles scattered around. But the creepiest thing? There was a weird symbol painted on the wall, almost like a sigil. I didn't know what it meant, but I definitely wasn't sticking around to find out. I tried to just forget about it, but then I started getting strange visits. A couple of times I saw a figure standing on the edge of my property, just watching. It wasn't like a normal neighbor. It was like they were waiting for something. I never got a clear look at them, but I was pretty freaked out. Then one day, I decided to call the seller just to ask a few questions. But when I did, I got this weird response. The guy sounded almost like he didn't recognize who I was, even though we'd just done the transaction a few weeks ago. He said he never owned the house and didn't know anything about it. I thought maybe he was just confused, but then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me, "You shouldn't have bought that house. People don't leave it for no reason." And then he hung up. That was it. I didn't know what to make of that phone call, but it completely shifted my perception of what I was dealing with. I felt like I had gotten in way over my head. To make matters worse, my neighbors started showing up at my door, demanding I leave. They told me that the house had a dark history, and that no one who had ever lived there had stayed for long. They said that the land was cursed, and that it wasn't a place for anyone to settle down. It got so bad that they even started talking about legal action, claiming I wasn't the rightful owner of the land. I didn't know who to trust anymore. I was scared, confused, and honestly, I just wanted out. But the problem was, I couldn't sell it. The title was a mess. There was some kind of weird discrepancy with the ownership that made it impossible to sell or transfer the deed. I tried reaching out to a lawyer, but it was clear that this wasn't a simple issue. I ended up abandoning the house. I couldn't live there anymore, and I was honestly terrified of what I might uncover if I stayed. I tried to contact the original seller again to get clarity on what was going on, but he disappeared. I don't even know where to begin to explain what happened, but I'll never forget that feeling of being trapped in something much bigger than I anticipated. So, yeah. Buying an abandoned tiny house? Would not recommend. 10-10, stay away from mysterious, cheap properties, especially ones with a shady past. Has anyone else experienced something like this?